A quick death, no matter how brutal, at least offers finality. But some deaths, designed not merely to end life but to dismantle it, stretch on for hours, for days. They are engineered to crush the spirit before the body fails, turning death into a theater of suffering. One such death belongs to a queen. She wasn't torn limb from limb, or burned at the stake, or beheaded in a single brutal blow. Instead, she died slowly, inch by inch, while the court around her watched, whispered, and waited. Her screams echoed through stone corridors for 3 days, a sound that would haunt her attendants for the rest of their lives. She begged for water, for air, for death. None came quickly, and when it did, it arrived as a mercy no one was allowed to grant her. History likes to sanitize this moment. Official records state she died of illness, perhaps infection or the fever, but buried beneath layers of polite revision is a far more disturbing truth. This was not an accident. This was a message. A queen who had risen too far, grown too powerful, loved too recklessly. Now left to rot from the inside out, her agony not hidden, but paraded. Centuries later, whispers remain. Accounts hidden in personal diaries, letters that escaped censors, and the tortured recollections of those who served her. All paint a chillingly different picture. Her death wasn't just prolonged. It was orchestrated, and it was meant to do more than kill her. It was meant to unmake her. She had been royalty, beloved, powerful, a symbol of elegance, defiance, and independence in a world where queens were supposed to smile and stay silent. But by the end, she lay curled on stone sheets soaked in sweat and blood, her lips cracked, her body twitching involuntarily as poison or infection tore through her nervous system. The servants who once dressed her in velvet and pearls now covered their faces with cloth to hide the stench of decay. Even her ladies-in-waiting stood at a distance, terrified to touch her, afraid they might catch her fate or worse, be accused of causing it. And through it all, she remained conscious. That was the point. The slow death of a queen was not just a tragedy. It was a lesson, a demonstration of what happens to women who step too far into male dominion, to queens who outshine their kings, to wives who refuse to play the part of political furniture. Because slow deaths do something fast deaths cannot. They let everyone watch. They let the court study every moment and draw the conclusions the crown wants them to draw. Her groans, her cries, her twisted limbs became propaganda. The royal physicians claimed to be doing everything they could, but their treatments did nothing. Some say they did worse than nothing, and so she suffered, delirious, gasping, blind with pain for 3 days. And when she finally died, it was not with peace. It was not with prayers. It was with the faint, final moan of a body that had been stripped of everything: dignity, strength, and hope. And then, just like that, she was gone. Not just from the court, but from memory, buried without ceremony, removed from paintings, her name erased from the family tree, as if she had never existed. But suffering leaves traces, and the truth refuses to stay buried forever. In this episode, we reconstruct her death. Not the polite version told in textbooks, but the real one. The one stitched together from forgotten letters, suppressed testimony, and eyewitness accounts that survived by hiding in footnotes and archives. This is not a story of royalty. This is a story of revenge, of a queen who died very, very slowly, and of a court that watched without blinking. History remembers kings as men of ambition, warriors, tyrants, visionaries. Queens, when they are remembered at all, are remembered by their attachments, wives, mothers, mistresses. But every so often, a queen steps beyond those roles, asserting not just influence but agency. And when she does, the walls of power begin to close around her. This queen was never supposed to matter. She wasn't born to rule, and yet she learned how. She came to court young, intelligent, elegant, politically sharp. Not beautiful in the obvious way that poets described, but charismatic. A woman people listened to even when she wasn't speaking. Her marriage to the king was arranged, of course, but that didn't stop her from turning the role of wife into something more. She didn't just support the king. She advised him, corrected him, outmaneuvered his ministers, and soon she knew too much. She understood the delicate balances of power that held the court together, the grudges between noble houses, the bribes paid to bishops, the lovers hidden behind curtained rooms. She saw the fault lines before they cracked. And when she began to use that knowledge, not for rebellion but simply for survival, the court took notice. They began calling her dangerous, not because she plotted against the king, but because she was too effective at protecting herself. Her influence was subtle. She rarely issued orders directly, but ministers found themselves consulting her before making key decisions. Ambassadors noted that negotiations went more smoothly when she was present. She restructured her household, increased patronage to writers and scholars, and dared to question the crown's increasing entanglement with foreign allies she didn't trust. And she wasn't quiet about it. That perhaps was her greatest mistake. She spoke her mind, not in outbursts, not in rage, but in cool, analytical precision. When the king proposed yet another unpopular alliance, she voiced her concerns in front of the council. When taxes were raised on the peasants to fund an unwinnable war, she asked where the funds were truly going. It was a question she already knew the answer to, and so did the room. That moment, according to one surviving account, darkened the air like a thundercloud. The king remained calm, but his silence was thick with calculation. From that day on, her words were no longer seen as wisdom. They were seen as threats, and the court, always eager to please its master, began to shift around her. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. Trusted ladies-in-waiting were reassigned. Letters she dictated never arrived. Her name stopped appearing in official records. Slowly, methodically, she was being edged toward the abyss. Not deposed, not disgraced. That would be too obvious. She would be forgotten, erased, bit by bit. But there was a problem. She refused to fade. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. She documented everything. She kept copies of letters. She met in secret with allies. Some say she was preparing for exile. Others believed she was about to confront the king publicly. Perhaps she thought her position was too secure. She was, after all, the queen. She had royal blood. She had the people's sympathy. She had children. But queens, as history has proven, only hold power when they're useful. And now she was inconvenient. She made her husband look weak. She made his ministers feel afraid. And in a court built on appearances, that was all the justification they needed. The official accounts don't record the meeting, but several letters from foreign envoys mention a sudden shift, a decision made in secret, likely between the king and his most ruthless advisors. A decision not to imprison her, not to banish her, but to remove her quietly. No trial, no charges, no scandal. Instead, something slower, something undeniable. An illness, natural, tragic, unquestionable. Within days, food began arriving from unfamiliar hands. Her favorite wine, once carefully selected from trusted merchants, was delivered by a new servant. Even her bath oils were changed. Her doctor, who had treated her for over a decade, was abruptly sent away on urgent court business. And then one morning, she woke with a chill she couldn't shake. The servants thought it was nothing. The court physician recommended warm compresses and rest. But by nightfall, she could no longer stand without help. Her stomach churned with fire, her vision blurred, her hands trembled, and her ladies-in-waiting, devoted, terrified, watched as the queen began to disappear from the inside out. What followed was not a single moment of violence, but a slow unraveling, a death that took its time, a carefully scripted act in which everyone played their part. The physicians who did everything, the courtiers who whispered prayers, the king who kept his distance. This was not a coup. It was not an assassination. It was a performance. And by the end of it, there would be no villain to blame. No gallows, no executioner's blade. Only a royal bedchamber that smelled of rot. Only a woman once revered, now twitching with fever, her hair soaked in sweat, her voice reduced to broken syllables. They didn't need to silence her. Her own body would do it for them. It started with a shiver, not dramatic, not alarming, the kind of chill that slips beneath the skin and lingers, barely enough to mention. She asked for another blanket. One of her ladies lit a brazier. The palace was drafty after all, but as the servants bustled to warm the room, none of them noticed the flush rising across the queen's collarbone, the pink hue that would, within hours, spread like wildfire. By midnight, she was burning, her skin scalded to the touch. Her nightgown clung to her with sweat. Her eyes darted beneath her lids like a woman trapped inside a nightmare. But she was not asleep. The fever kept her painfully awake. Her mind raced, thoughts splintered, unable to form words as heat consumed her from within. When the doctor arrived, he offered the usual remedies: a tincture of wormwood and vinegar, cold cloths for the forehead, a whispered prayer from the chaplain. But there was no diagnosis, no name for the illness, only a muttered phrase scrawled in the physician's log: distemper of the blood, a phrase that meant nothing and everything. By dawn, she could no longer walk. When they tried to help her to the privy, her knees buckled. She collapsed on the stone floor, retching, her fingers clawing for balance that wouldn't come. Blood appeared in her vomit. Not much, just a trace, but enough for her ladies to look at one another and say nothing. They carried her back to the bed. From there, she would never rise again. Day 1. The pain came in waves, crashing through her body like a storm with no eye. Her spine arched against the mattress involuntarily. Her teeth chattered, despite the fire in her veins. Her throat, raw from vomiting, made speech nearly impossible. And still she tried to speak, to ask where her children were, to demand her personal physician, to beg for water. Her ladies-in-waiting did what they could. They dampened her brow. They whispered psalms. But they were no longer certain what they were allowed to do. Courtiers had begun to appear at her door, not to offer help, but to watch. Not all executions take place on a scaffold. Some happen in bedsheets and take 3 days to complete. By midday, the queen's bedchamber had become a kind of theatrical purgatory. Attendants filed in and out in ceremonial rhythms, not to comfort, but to be seen comforting, to say later that they had done their duty. Outside, in the corridor, courtiers whispered in tight knots, waiting not for her recovery, but for her confirmation of death. They had already begun discussing succession. They had already decided her fate. All that remained was for her body to catch up. And yet, she refused to die. The body, it seems, does not always surrender on time. By evening, her pulse was frantic, pounding visibly at her neck. Her eyes were wide, red, and dry. She could no longer blink. The physicians attempted to bleed her, thinking it would rebalance the humors. They cut into her forearm and watched as the blood dripped sluggishly onto cloth. It did nothing, except weaken her further. When she tried to speak, her lips trembled without sound. One of her ladies claimed she was trying to ask for her confessor. Another insisted she was praying. A third, perhaps more honest, believed she was simply trying to scream. The sounds she made were not words. They were animal sounds. Groans, gurgles, wet gasps. Her lungs had begun to fill. Her breath, once rapid and sharp, now arrived in shallow, erratic stutters. And all the while, she remained conscious. That was the horror. That was what her enemies had hoped for. They didn't just want her to die. They wanted her to know she was dying. Minute by agonizing minute. Day 2. She could no longer move. Her limbs had grown stiff, not with death but with pain. Her fingers curled inward, locked by fevered muscles. Her face was a mask of agony, and though her eyes were open, they no longer focused on anything. But still she listened, and still she felt. When her ladies wiped her brow, she flinched. When they adjusted her pillows, her back arched. When they whispered her name, hoping, praying, her lips twitched. She was still there, somewhere inside the decaying shell. And she still wanted something, but no one knew what, or dared to ask. She had been a queen, a mother, patron of artists, a voice in court, a political force. But now, she was reduced to a mouth that couldn't speak and a body that refused to die. In the adjacent chamber, A priest waited, pacing. He had not yet been summoned. He, too, was part of the theater, withheld until the last moment. Perhaps the court wanted to see if she would confess. Perhaps they feared what she might say if she did. The confessional could be dangerous, and queens, even dying ones, had a way of telling the truth. By nightfall, a silence had fallen over the palace. Not of mourning, but of anticipation. The kind of silence that precedes a pronouncement. Her enemies waited. Her allies prayed. Her husband? He did not visit. He had not been seen since the first night. They said he was busy, that he was in council. But everyone knew he was waiting too. By the morning of the third day, the queen's bedchamber no longer resembled a place of care. It had become a stage. The air stank of fever and stale incense. Her body had begun to betray her fully. Bladder loosened, skin yellowed, the flesh beneath her fingernails darkening as circulation failed. And yet the parade of courtiers did not stop. If anything, it increased. Because now the queen's death had a purpose. Not spiritual, not medical, political. Whispers filled the antechamber. Would she live long enough to make a final confession? Would she name conspirators? Would she attempt to reclaim her honor from the grave? These weren't the questions of grieving subjects. These were calculations, the grim arithmetic of power brokers tallying how her words might shift alliances or stain reputations. And so they waited. Each nobleman and lady-in-waiting who passed through her chamber did so not to comfort, but to witness, to observe her suffering, to collect details, to later retell the story in court, shaped to whatever narrative best served their faction. They watched her twist, moan, whisper to no one, and then they stepped out and said, "She's delirious. She's raving. She's being punished." That last line, "She is being punished," spread fastest. It offered something no one could resist, moral absolution. The suggestion that her agony was not just physical, but deserved. No one could say exactly what her sins were. The rumors shifted by the hour. Adultery, witchcraft, ambition, heresy. She had been too outspoken, too visible, too clever, too unfeminine, too inconvenient. When a queen is dying, truth becomes a luxury few can afford, and lies are infinitely more useful. Outside, the bells remained silent. No announcement had been made. The court refused to officially acknowledge her condition, a grotesque charade of formality. But within the palace walls, the preparations had begun. Tapestries were taken down, portraits removed, court painters instructed to cease all commissions bearing her likeness. Her crest, a lioness flanked by lilies, was quietly scratched off a newly cast ceremonial sword. She wasn't dead yet, but she had already ceased to exist. Meanwhile, another room, several corridors away, had come alive with purpose. The Privy Council had gathered, scrolls unfurled, genealogies re-examined, marriage contracts rewritten in ink still wet. It was, as one observer noted, as though a new queen were already seated upon the throne, if only they could clear the body of the old. No trial, no scandal, no fanfare, just quiet erasure, royal amnesia. The symbolism was brutal. Her personal physician, who had served her for over 10 years, was refused entrance. His credentials suddenly called into question. His replacement, a younger court-appointed doctor with ties to the king's chief advisor, insisted on treating her, even as he offered no treatments that eased her pain. Some believe he was instructed not to. Some believe he didn't need instruction. What mattered wasn't whether she lived or died. What mattered was how she was seen as she died. And in those final hours, the court painted her in every shade that suited them. As a fallen woman, punished for ambition. As a sinner consumed by divine judgment. As a mad woman, babbling through fevered hallucinations. But she was none of those things. She was dying, and she knew it. One of her attendants, who would later enter a convent, never speaking publicly of what she had seen, wrote in a private journal. She looked at me as if to say, "They want me gone, but I'm still here." Her eyes said more than any sermon. Still, no priest had been summoned. The queen had asked or tried to through cracked lips on the second day. But her request was delayed. A convenient oversight, one that left her without final confession, without absolution, without the church's comfort. For a woman of her rank and time, it was a spiritual execution, layered atop the physical. And then, as the third night approached, the atmosphere shifted. The king's messenger arrived. He did not go to the queen. He did not kneel by her bedside or ask after her health. Instead, he delivered a sealed scroll to the council and departed. Its contents were never publicly revealed, but its effects were immediate. That night, the bells rang, not to announce her death, but to summon the court to prayer. A soft, public signal the end was near. Inside the bedchamber, the queen's breaths had become shallow, almost inaudible. Her lips moved in silent rhythm. No one could hear the words, but one lady believed she was reciting a psalm from memory. Others believed she was praying for her children. Still, no priest arrived. When they finally allowed one to enter, a full hour later, she was unconscious. The priest administered the last rites to a woman who could no longer hear him. But the court could. They saw the ritual, and that was enough. They had their closure. She was no longer a queen. She was a narrative. The moment her breathing stopped, a servant was dispatched not to her children, but to the king. He did not react. He merely nodded. One witness said he turned back to his wine. Another claimed he smiled faintly. Either way, he did not speak her name. She did not die with dignity. There was no hush in the chamber, no gentle folding of hands, no priest holding a candle by her bedside. She did not squeeze the hand of a child or whisper parting words. She slipped into death in silence, a twisted figure drenched in sweat, foam crusting at her lips, body curled like a broken branch. Her eyes, wide open in the end, stared at something or nothing, just above the canopy of her bed. A single gasp escaped her throat. Then, nothing. No weeping from courtiers, no tolling of bells, just the sound of shifting cloth as her ladies quietly stepped back from the bed, unsure